18th of November 1942, above the South Pacific, near Henderson Field, Solomon Islands. A veteran Japanese driver, proud of his 13 victories, watched the sky with the tranquility of someone who had already dominated the air over China and the Philippines. That day, he believed he would face another patrol of slow, predictable wildcats. The enemy, they said, was still incapable of creating anything to compare with Zero. That certainty would be crushed in a few minutes by two engines that roared like thunder and rose like aluminum demons. A new type of fighter appeared on the horizon, not only faster, but unreachable. The P-38 Lightning did not come to compete in maneuvers in circles. He came to hunt from above, attack without being seen, and disappear. It was the end of the war, as Japan knew it. This is the story of how the pride of imperial aviation found the limit of courage in the face of a machine created by American industry. An unequal confrontation between doctrine and system, tradition and innovation. When Japanese pilots discovered that they could not climb, flee, or react, they realized too late. The enemy was not just another plane. It was the future. But before we dive into the data, there's one statistic that defines this story. In less than 3 years, the P-38 Lightning was responsible for the destruction of more than 1,800 Japanese aircraft in the Pacific. A single American pilot, Richard Bong, shot down 40 enemy planes, all aboard a Lightning. On the other side, Japan ended the war with pilots who had barely completed 100 hours of flight time. In 1945, its commanders began to prohibit direct engagement with the P-38s, not out of cowardice, but out of simple calculation of survival. What starts as a technical doubt soon turns into a strategic collapse. How did an eccentric-looking plane, rejected by Japanese doctrine, become the nightmare of the empire of the rising sun? If you value history, memory, and analyzing the facts behind myths, consider unliking and subscribing to the channel. This helps this content continue to reveal what the war taught, and what the world almost forgot. In 1941, the Japanese Navy flew with the certainty that it dominated the skies. The Mitsubishi A6M-0, the pride of the empire's aircraft industry, was celebrated as a technical prodigy, light, with a range superior to any fighter of its time, capable of maneuvering with almost supernatural precision, and flown by men shaped by the Bushido Code, trained not just to fly, but to die with honor. This set created a myth that spread quickly across the Pacific. Over China, in the Philippines, at Pearl Harbor and Java, the Zeros emerged from the clouds as lethal ghosts, shot down enemies in sharp turns, and disappeared. No Allied fighters could follow them. Japanese doctrine, refined during the years of combat in Manchuria and the war against China, was based on the belief that pilot skill was the deciding factor. The machine should serve human dexterity, not limit its talent. In this scenario, the Zero was the perfect tool. No armor, no self-sealing tanks, but incredibly light and responsive. The philosophy was simple. If you don't get hit, you don't need protection. And the Japanese pilots really weren't getting hit. The first engagements with the U.S. Navy's F-4F Wildcats reinforced this illusion. Slow, poorly armed, with limited visibility and late responses to commands, the Wildcats became easy prey in the aerial ballet dominated by Japanese aces. The reports returned to the admirals in Tokyo as confirmations of a just and unshakable doctrine. The Americans had no spirit, no skill, and their planes stood no chance. It was only a matter of time before they retreated from the Pacific. But behind that confidence was a silent neglect, one that showed up not in combat manuals, but in production spreadsheets and engineering labs. Japan, when designing Zero, ignored a critical factor: scalability. It was an exceptional fighter for duels, but impossible to adapt to the new directions of the war. While Japanese engineers were trying to protect the aircraft's pride without sacrificing its lightness, The Americans were designing a completely different machine, a fighter that didn't need to win in tight corners, but in altitude, power, and persistence. Still, in 1941, Japan did not see this scenario. He had won too many battles to suspect that war would require more than courage. The irony is clear. The more the Zero proved effective, the more the Japanese became convinced that they didn't need to change anything. War, for them, was a matter of honor and skill, not of engines and metallurgy. The Empire did not know, but it was already late. In laboratories at Lockheed and General Motors, tests with superchargers, light alloys and modular armor were already underway. On American soil, mechanized production lines could manufacture more than 1,000 aircraft per month. Japan, at the peak of its capacity, barely exceeded 100. The difference was abysmal. And if you were surprised by this number, comment below, shocking data. Because this is the central point that the Japanese ignored. They were winning, yes, but they were winning an old war while the new era had already taken off. The real shock had not yet arrived. It would come from the sea with 2 engines roaring above the clouds, and I would leave in the air the question that no Japanese general could answer in time: how to face an enemy that you cannot reach. When the P-38 Lightning first appeared in the skies over the Pacific in mid-1942, its image baffled Japanese observers. Empire Naval Intelligence recorded the presence of an aircraft with 2 tails, 2 engines, and an unusual shape, but quickly classified it as a light bomber or reconnaissance plane. The analysis was based not on technical data, but on doctrinal assumption. By Japanese standards, a fighter with 2 engines was unfeasible, too heavy, too slow, inefficient. The Zero was the absolute benchmark, light, agile, and pure. Anything other than that could only be a mistake. But the reports began to pile up. Something strange was happening in the skirmishes around Guadalcanal. Planes that emerged from the sea climbed faster than the Zeros, reached higher altitudes, and most disconcertingly, dived over Japanese formations with devastating precision, only to then disappear in vertical maneuvers that the Imperial pilots could not keep up with. On the field, the first reports were treated with skepticism. Many commanders even suggested that the pilots were confusing different aircraft. Others insinuated that it was nervousness or American propaganda. But the losses began to be repeated. Japanese fighters were shot down before they even saw the enemy. When they could finally identify the attacker, all they saw was a bright trail of aluminum disappearing into the altitude. The aircraft that had initially been derided as rude was beginning to take on a new identity in the skies of the Pacific, an astonishing presence, one that did not duel, but hunt. On land, American mechanics and technicians called the P-38 Lightning for its speed and sudden attack. But among Japanese pilots, a different nickname began to circulate: the dual-tailed demons. The aircraft's unusual structure, 2 rear stabilizers connected by a central section where the cockpit was, made it unmistakable. It was an unthinkable design by Japanese standards, whose engineering was still inspired by classical lines and functional symmetry. The P-38 looked like a design error until it kills. Its visual impact preceded its action. His unusual silhouette caused strangeness even before he opened fire. And when it opened, the damage was immediate. Equipped with 4 50-caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon concentrated in the nose, the Lightning fired in a straight line without relying on the convergence of the guns in the wings, a factor that made its burst extremely accurate. One Japanese driver described the feeling as taking a beating before the fight even starts. The clash was not only tactical, it was cultural. The P-38 did not try to win in the same field as the Zeros. He didn't duel, he didn't twirl in the sky in romantic combat maneuvers. He climbed, observed, dived, destroyed. The philosophy was American to the bone: altitude superiority, approach speed, firepower, all based on numbers, engineering, and logistics. While the Zero relied on intuition and individual skill, the P-38 operated as a component of a larger system, a fighter designed to work in synergy with radar, reconnaissance, bombers, and offensive doctrine. It was a product of modern warfare. Still, the Japanese leadership resisted accepting what the field reports showed. How could a heavy fighter dictate the pace of combat? How could an aircraft that violated so many rules of engineering be so effective? The answer, which few dared to vocalize, lay in the factories of Burbank, California. There, Lockheed operated with more than 60,000 employees in continuous shifts, testing, tuning, and producing an airplane that was born not from the inspiration of a single engineer, but from the systematic iteration of teams made up of scientists, technicians, metallurgists, and test pilots. The P-38 was a collective creation, something that Japanese industry had not yet been able to replicate. Its bizarre appearance hid millimeter precision. The Lightning flew at more than 660 km/h, climbed at 4,500 feet per minute, and reached altitudes where the Zero's engine lost power drastically. Above 6,000 meters, the Lightning became unreachable. By this time, the Zeros could barely maintain effective control of the rudders. The turbo supercharger of the Allison V1710 engines kept the P-38's performance almost unchanged, up to 12,000 meters of altitude. Japan did not possess anything similar, and the most devastating, there was no way to produce something like this in a timely manner. By 1942, while the Japanese were still disassembling and analyzing parts of a captured P-40, the Americans had already begun mass shipments of P-38s to the Pacific Theater, including units trained for twin flight, photographic reconnaissance, and long-range operations. Zero, until then a symbol of invincibility, began to show its age. Designed in 1937 for a specific type of combat, the plane was not designed for adaptation. It was built to win quickly, not to endure for years in a war of industrial attrition. And the war, as Japan would soon discover, was just beginning. Because in the days following the P-38's arrival, a new kind of mission would take shape, one that would redefine the very concept of air warfare. The ability to shoot down an enemy leader with surgical precision at just the right minute, in the most unlikely place. And that attack would come from a Lightning. November 18th, 1942. The sky over Guadalcanal dawned covered by low clouds and accumulated tension. The Henderson Field Air Base, still scarred by the bloody fighting of the previous weeks, became the scene of a moment invisible to the world, but decisive for the history of air warfare. At 7:40 a.m., the P-38 Lightnings of the 339th Fighter Squadron, assigned to escort B-17 bombers during an interdiction mission against Japanese positions on neighboring islands, took off from the makeshift runway. On the other side, pilots of the 204th Kokutai, veterans of multiple combats, were launched from their forward base with a clear mission: to protect the skies from the American offensive. The two groups did not yet know it, but they were about to usher in a new era in air combat. The P-38s climbed in tight formation, quickly reaching 25,000 feet. Its supercharged twin motors rumbled bass above the clouds, invisible to Japanese eyes. The pilots maintained radio silence. No unnecessary maneuvering, no provocation. It was just physics applied to the aerial domain: speed, altitude, energy. When the Japanese fighters spotted the bombers, there was no apparent sign of an escort. But then, from the upper layers of the sky, lightning came out. The Lightnings dived with controlled angle, fixed targets without hesitation. Within seconds, the 20mm cannons and machine guns concentrated in the nose turned the battlefield into an invisible ambush. A Zero exploded in the air. Another lost his left wing. A third went into a tailspin out of control after a precise shot into the fuel tank. None of the P-38s were even hit. The fight lasted just over 3 minutes. No curve, no aerial dance, only calculation, kinetic energy, and lethality. The Japanese doctrine, based on the art of maneuver, collapsed before the mathematics of domination. The Imperial pilots, trained for close combat and confident in their ability to turn faster than any enemy, found that there was no more visible enemy. The fight did not take place where they expected. It came from above and finished before they could react. For Japanese commanders, the report was baffling. 3 aircraft lost, none confirmed shot down. A new type of fighter, acting outside of known standards, executing a mission with coolness, discipline, and efficiency that sounded more like aerial artillery than combat aviation. The official response was hesitant. Investigate. But in the field, among the surviving drivers, the feeling was more visceral. It was not fear of death. It was fear of irrelevance. The battlefield they knew was gone. The P-38 not only eschewed traditional combat, it made it obsolete. Later, a Japanese pilot described the episode with a simple but revealing phrase: "There was no combat, there was execution." And indeed, what the Americans had accomplished that day was more than a tactical victory. It was a public demonstration that the terms of the war had changed. The Zero's legendary maneuverability, celebrated in manuals and propaganda magazines, had no value against an opponent who chose the field, the time, and the height of engagement. And this pattern would be repeated. In January 1943, a new mission over Bougainville followed the same script. The P-38s climbed up first, chose the point of attack, and destroyed targets before the Zeros had time to react. American pilot Thomas Lynch, after one of these missions, wrote, "They are still trying to hunt us down as if we were flying a P-40, but we're not in the same game anymore." And indeed, the game had changed. Because unlike the engagements that marked the beginning of the war, where the outcome depended on the talent of individual aces, the new standard was set by integrated systems, aircraft that operated within tactical doctrines, and logistics chains tuned to maximize every action. The P-38s represented this in essence. Each takeoff was preceded by precise planning. Each mission involved logistical support that ensured fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and intelligence reports. The U.S. Air Force didn't just fly better, it was structured to sustain excellence. Meanwhile, the Japanese faced increasing attrition. Its veteran pilots were irreplaceable. The losses piled up, and the field reports began to carry a previously unthinkable tone: caution. It was in this climate that an informal order began to circulate among some Japanese squadrons in late 1942. If you see double-tailed fighters, avoid combat. The doctrine of attack at any cost began to give way in the face of technical reality. But institutional resistance was still strong. For imperial strategists, admitting that they were being outclassed meant rewriting an entire vision of war. Doctrinal arrogance, fueled by years of early victories, prevented them from seeing what was already in front of them. And while the debates dragged on in the offices, the P-38s kept rising, attacking and disappearing. On the next mission, it wouldn't just be escorted bombers. It would be something bigger, a surgical precision strike that would traverse 700 kilometers of open sea, guided by calculations, extra fuel, and a plan as daring as it is ruthless. An attack that would kill Japan's greatest strategist, and that would seal, once and for all, the new dominance in the skies of the Pacific. When Japanese engineers finally gained access to the wreckage of a downed P-38 in 1943, the bewilderment was immediate. There, among cast aluminum parts and hydraulic control cables, was something that went beyond a simple fighter jet. It was an industrial statement. The Lightning carried 2 Allison V1710 engines, each equipped with a General Electric turbocharged supercharger that kept performance virtually stable up to 40,000 feet altitude. This meant that while the Zero's Nakajima engines began to lose power from 6,000 meters, the P-38 still operated at almost full power at more than twice that height. The advantage was brutal, and it wasn't just a matter of speed. It was altitude, acceleration in diving, and above all, energy. The armament was concentrated in the nose, 4 50-caliber machine guns and a 20-minute Hispano cannon, all lined up with lethal impact even at long range. Unlike the Zeros, which relied on the convergence of weapons on the wings and required cornering approach, the Lightning could shoot down a target more than 300 meters away with deadly accuracy. The controls were assisted by a hydraulic system, ensuring maneuverability even at high speeds. The Zero, on the other hand, began to lose response above 600 km/h, and if it dived beyond that, it was at structural risk. The difference was so stark that Japanese engineers classified the Lightning as unfeasible to reproduce, not for lack of knowledge, but for lack of infrastructure. Japan simply did not have the industrial resources, the special metals, or the scale of production necessary for something similar. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them, but his doctrine still stuck to extreme lightness, close duel, and pilot supremacy did not allow him to see what the war demanded. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content about the invisible gears of history. The Japanese philosophy of combat was based on elegance and audacity. The American was based on statistics, power, and redundancy. With each mission, the P-38 demonstrated not only technical superiority, but conceptual superiority. It was not designed to fit the known rules of air warfare. It was designed to break them. The Lightning carried armor behind the pilot, self-sealing fuel tanks, and reinforced airframe to withstand cannon fire. Zero had none of these elements. It was a lethal machine only when it operated under full control and when the environment allowed its lightness to shine. But as the skies of the Pacific filled with heavy bombers, escort fighters, and mobile radars, that lightness became fragility. Japanese pilots began to realize this, slowly. In high-altitude combat, their planes did not climb. In chases, their engines overheated. On dives, its wings vibrated dangerously. War was no longer a matter of maneuver, but a contest of energy. And there, Japan simply could not compete. The engineering of the P-38, thought up by Kelly Johnson and his team at Lockheed, represented a new way of thinking about air warfare. A fast, heavy, resistant fighter with enough autonomy to cross oceans. Its range, more than 3,700 kilometers with external tanks, allowed it to operate on missions where other fighters simply couldn't reach. It was at once interceptor, escort, and reconnaissance aircraft. What to the Japanese seemed like a design aberration was actually the first truly multi-purpose fighter of the war. Japan still did not understand this. The military leadership continued to invest in updated versions of the Zero, trying to extract more performance from a concept that had already been born with an expiration date. The A6M5, for example, gained speed at the expense of range. The A6M7 received minor protections but sacrificed maneuverability. No variant was a match for the P-38. The doctrine was beginning to break down, but no one wanted to say it out loud. A Japanese pilot, a survivor of 3 combats with Lightnings, wrote in his diary, "They fly as if they were made never to descend." The phrase, more than technical, was existential. It represented the beginning of the psychological collapse of the Japanese air elite. Because it wasn't just about losing planes, it was a question of losing the right to fight on one's own terms. And this collapse had not yet reached its apex. It would take full shape weeks later, when a squadron of P-38s crossed more than 700 kilometers of open sea, guided by precise intelligence, on a mission that would change the war. and leave Japan without its greatest strategic brain. The first sign of the collapse wasn't a sound, it was the absence of it. Japanese pilots began to report something unusual in their mission reports. They were being attacked without warning, with no engine roaring in the distance, no evasive maneuvers detected. Just sudden explosions, precise bursts, fire and disappearance. What seemed like an isolated failure soon repeated itself. The P-38 Lightnings would swoop in, silent as nocturnal predators, hit targets and return to the sky before any Zeros could react. The secret was in the turbochargers. Mounted on the rear sections of each engine, the P-38's compressors not only guaranteed performance at altitude, but muffled the characteristic sound of the engines. The result was an almost mute air attack. An invisible ambush. The air war, until then celebrated as a duel between knights of the skies, took on the contours of a fighter, and the roles were reversed. The imperial elite, who once patrolled the air with absolute dominance, now looked up in fear. On patrol missions, Zeros would disappear without explanation. The squadrons returned incomplete. The shaken survivors described the new pattern with one word: impotence. There was no way to overcome what was not seen. The maneuvers, once trained with samurai precision, became useless. The turn-in curve, a trademark of the Japanese doctrine, now served only to expose the flank. The pilot who tried to maneuver became prey. What went up was slaughtered. What ran away, caught. It was cruel mathematics and unbeatable. On the ground, the reactions began to change. Some commanders even proposed emergency tactical adjustments. Only engage Lightnings with a numerical advantage greater than 5 against 1. Others suggested that the Zero should no longer be used as an air superiority fighter, but rather only as an interceptor of slow targets. The doctrine was collapsing, but to admit it was heresy. The Bushido Code still reigned supreme in the speeches, even when it had already died in the skies. The morale of the squads began to crumble. The pilots, pressured to maintain their honor, lived the conflict between two worlds, the technical reality and the ideology of sacrifice. Some began to hesitate on takeoffs, others simply did not return. At a forward base in the Marshall Islands, a sergeant wrote in his diary, "They come out of nowhere. We have gone up, and they are already above. They shoot like machines, disappear like clouds. It is no longer a war, it's a slaughter." The psychological effect was so severe that in 1943, the Japanese command began to limit the deployment of new pilots to fronts where the P-38 frequently operated. Air warfare began to be mapped into terror zones. Where there was lightning, there was caution. The Japanese, who had begun the war by deciding the fight, now lived under the weight of waiting. Wait for the attack, wait for the impact, wait for the end. The U.S. Air Force, aware of this, has stepped up the use of altitude reconnaissance with F-5 versions of the Lightning, unarmed but too fast to intercept. The message was clear. Not even in silence would the Japanese have peace. And if they flew, they would be seen. If they were seen, they would be hunted. A war of nerves was ensuing. What was once a theater of bravery became an environment of constant surveillance. American supremacy was not only in metal, but in the psychological. In 1944, a Japanese official wrote in a confidential report, "The Lightning doesn't just win, he humiliates." Because more than defeating the enemy, the P-38 disfigured its combat logic. It took away his control, it subtracted time from it. And he left, in place of honor, panic. And this panic had not yet reached its peak. It would take real shape when Americans stopped hunting only planes and started eliminating commanders. The Lightning's next mission wouldn't just be technical, it would be symbolic, and it would transform the concept of air warfare forever. April 18th, 1943. The sunrise over the Solomon Islands carried no visible omens. But on that day, the skies would witness the most devastating symbolic turning point of the air war in the Pacific. At 07:10 a.m., 16 P-38 Lightning fighters took off from the Guadalcanal base with external tanks and clear orders to fly for more than 700 kilometers over the open sea in absolute radio silence at an altitude of just 15 meters, following a route traced with millimeter precision. The objective was not to attack a base, nor to escort bombers. It was unprecedented, intercepting and eliminating the supreme commander of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the man behind the attack on Pearl Harbor, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. The mission had been conceived on the basis of deciphered intelligence. The Americans had broken Japanese naval codes and discovered the exact itinerary of Yamamoto's flight between the islands of Rabaul and Bougainville. From this information, the flight time, fuel consumption, the attack window, and the ideal altitude to surprise the escort were calculated. Everything needed to work with surgical precision, and it worked. When the group of lightnings emerged in the sky over Bougainville at 09:34 a.m., Yamamoto was traveling in a Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber, escorted by 6 Zero fighters. But the surprise was total. The P-38s appeared out of nowhere, rising in unison as a coordinated swarm. 2 Lightnings stepped in to engage the escort. The others aimed directly at the main target. Lieutenant Rex Barber was the first to open fire. Its burst pierced through the G4M's fuselage with brutal precision. Yamamoto's plane quickly lost altitude, crashed into trees, and exploded in a jungle field. The mission lasted less than 5 minutes. The Zeros, caught by surprise, managed to react late, but did not prevent the result. For the Japanese, the impact was catastrophic. Yamamoto was not just a commander. He was a national symbol, a brilliant strategist, and the architect of imperial expansion in the Pacific. His death, executed with such precision and daring, exposed not only the physical vulnerability of the Japanese military leadership, but the absolute superiority of American planning, intelligence, and execution capabilities. Kenji Yanaga, one of the pilots of the escort, survived and reported years later, "It was not combat. It was a sentence. They knew where we were, at what time, at what altitude. They were waiting. What the Japanese called the art of air warfare, the Americans now practiced as an applied science. The Yamamoto mission became a watershed. No other episode of the war so clearly expressed the gulf between Japanese doctrine, still anchored in the spirit of individual combat, and the American approach, based on systems, data, and total integration. From intercepting the code to synchronizing flight over the sea without visual references, the operation was a triumph of engineering, mathematics, and blind reliance on a plan. And the most symbolic, it was executed by P-38s. The plane that had been underestimated, ridiculed, and classified as unviable was now the executor of a mission worthy of strategy books. The Lightning legend was sealed. For the Japanese, however, this legend was a shadow. Yamamoto's death was not just an operational loss. It was a profound moral blow. If not even the most important man in the Navy was safe in the air, who would be? For the first time, the concept of air superiority changed its meaning. It was no longer a question of who won the most fights, but who decided when, where, and how the fight began. And in this new field, Japan no longer had a place. But the impact of the P-38 would not end there. Because while the double-tails marked the Pacific sky, another invisible threat was already approaching, silent, relentless, fueled by factories on the other side of the ocean. A new generation of pilots was being trained en masse, and the numbers that were to come would make even Japanese veterans doubt their own memory. By mid-1944, the truth was undeniable to even the most experienced pilots in Japan. What began as doctrinal confidence had become an unbearable burden. The legendary Zero fighter, once a symbol of aerial dominance, now represented a trap. Light, agile, effective in short combats and tight maneuvers, the A6M was designed for a type of warfare that no longer existed. Speed now decided, altitude dominated, energy ruled, and in those three dimensions, zero no longer had a place. Saburo Sakai himself, a Japanese ace with more than 60 confirmed victories, wrote in his diary, "The P-38 was not an opponent, it was a wall. We saw, we tried to react, and it was too late. When trying to maneuver, the Zeros lost speed. When they fled, they were hunted. When they climbed, they were left behind. It didn't matter the angle, lightning dictated the combat." The doctrine that exalted close combat, individual mastery, and heroic sacrifice had been projected into another era. And now it became not only obsolete, but lethal to those who followed it. The Japanese training, still centered on combat techniques in 1938, did not prepare the new pilots for the reality of 1944. Meanwhile, the Americans accelerated. The P-38 gained more powerful variants, with larger tanks, gyroscopic sights, improved armor, and refined controls. The maintenance units received spare parts within days. Japan, on the other hand, improvised. It lacked metal alloys, high-octane fuel, and trained pilots. In 1945, the average flight hours before combat for a Japanese pilot was less than 100. The Americans, on the other hand, trained pilots with more than 250 hours of flight time in simulators with updated tactics within integrated squadrons. The difference was stark. American industrial production played on another level. In 1943 alone, the United States manufactured 9,900 P-38 Lightning. In that same period, Japan was barely able to produce 2,300 units of all variants of the Zero, a difference of more than 4 times. But the most shocking number would come soon after. While the P-38s received improvements every 6 months, the Zero fought with the same airframe from 1941 until the end of the war. Pause. If this statistic surprised you, comment below. Absolute power, logistics wins, or simply shocking data, because this is the essence of modern warfare. Whoever can adapt the fastest wins, and Japan couldn't. The technical and industrial structure of the empire had been designed for short campaigns, for fighting in nearby regions. There was no plan for years of war against an enemy with continental resources, abundant energy, and the ability to produce and test uninterruptedly. Not only did the Lightnings fly higher and faster, they evolved. Each new wave that arrived in the Pacific brought improvements that responded directly to combat observations, adjusted armor where most impacts were received, optimized fuel compression, electronics overhauled. The airplane was a living project. Zero was a dead dogma. The conflict is no longer a competition of pilots to become a clash between worldviews, one based on honor, spirit, and glory, the other based on data, process, and accuracy. A fighter represented the memory of an empire, the other, the birth of a new way of waging war. And this difference would become even more visible when the skies ceased to be a battlefield and become a corridor for the systematic destruction of Japanese factories, because the next stage would no longer be about combats between planes. It would be about denying the enemy even the right to produce. By the end of 1944, the air war in the Pacific was no longer about who flew better, but about who thought differently. The contrast was brutal. On the one hand, Japan, still stuck in the belief that individual courage and fighting spirit were enough to conquer the skies. On the other, the United States, operating as a living machine, where every cog, from the factory worker to the pilot in the cockpit, was part of a cohesive and lethal system. The P-38 Lightning was the emblem of this difference. It wasn't just a fighter, it was a vector of doctrine, a flying artifact shaped by combat reports, precision engineering, and logistical objectives. With each mission, their systems were evaluated. At each return, data was collected. And with each new batch produced, improvements were incorporated. not by intuition, but by analysis. Japan, on the other hand, relied on its aces, on techniques passed down from generation to generation, and on an honor that, although noble, became tragic in the face of the mathematical coldness of modern warfare. The Zero, with its admirable lightness and hypnotic maneuverability, now exploded at the slightest impact. Its tank was not self-sealing. Its structure could not withstand extreme dives. Its armor, it was non-existent. The P-38, even though it hit one of the engines, was returning home. Its redundancy system allowed flights with only one active booster. In long-range combat, this difference meant survival. In logistics, it meant saving human resources. And in doctrine, it meant that a living pilot could fight again. At American training centers, cadets went through more than 600 flight hours before being considered ready. The Japanese, desperate to replace losses, agreed to send young men with little more than 100 hours to face enemies who had trained in simulators, flown in formation, and practiced engagements under tactical control. It was like sending a classic swordsman to fight computerized aiming gunners. The disparity was visible even on the ground. While Japan produced spare parts under rationing, the United States manufactured complete replacement kits, allowing each squadron to operate autonomously. American mechanics received technical training, had standardized manuals, catalogued parts, and auditable processes. The war wasn't just in the air, it was won on the ground, on the drawing boards, on the assembly mats, and in the command centers. The P-38 flew in pairs, a tactic adopted to ensure mutual coverage and increase the rate of return of missions. Each pilot knew his role within the tactical pattern. The Japanese, on the other hand, still operated as isolated warriors, where personal initiative was praised, even if it cost the mission. The result was predictable. Americans chose when and where to fight. They attacked at altitude, dived with advantage, avoided the rotated combat, and disappeared. The Japanese, in trying to answer, entered into familiar patterns, which the Americans had already studied, dissected, and annulled. It was the war of systems against the war of ideals. And the system won. With each air defeat, Japan did not lose only planes. I lost pilots, lost experience, lost morale, and the most serious, lost time. Because in the meantime, the United States was graduating another 100, another 1,000. It was a production line of military effectiveness, effective because he learned, cold because she operated without passion, relentless because it did not depend on a single man, but on a process in constant improvement. In 1944, American production of fighters exceeded 96,000 examples. Japan, in the same period, manufactured just over 28,000. It was no longer a competition. It was a technical hit and run. And the P-38, even though it was about to be replaced by more modern generations like the P-51, still operated efficiently enough to dominate entire fronts. It was, literally, a system with wings. The public began to understand then that the triumph in the skies was not just from an airplane. It was a way of thinking, of a national capacity to integrate science, industry, planning, and execution with speed and flexibility. Japan entered the war with metal samurai. The United States responded with flying engineers. And the result was a war without a duel, just slaughter. But the ultimate impact of this American fighting machine was yet to come. Because in addition to dominating the skies, she would begin to control time. Interdiction missions, large-scale bombings, multi-spindle operations, all orchestrated with near absolute precision. Japanese aviation, once a national glory, would soon have to watch helplessly the systematic destruction of its own cities, without even being able to take off. They had young faces, calm voices, and looks trained not to hesitate. They were children of industry, trained in hangars, fed by statistics and shaped by instruction manuals. Richard Bong, Thomas Maguire, Charles MacDonald, names which in a few months became legends not for their theatricality, but for their constancy. Bong, with 40 confirmed victories, has never given a rallying cry. Maguire, meticulous to the point of obsession, recorded each mission as if it were an equation. MacDonald discreetly preferred to talk to his joystick. They did not duel, they eliminated. The American air war had changed its symbol. Out come the lone aces of individual epics. In came the operators of systematized air warfare, each pilot a piece of a larger process, each mission a timed, studied, replicable operation. It was no longer about bravery, it was about execution. And the Japanese took notice. Japan's combat reports went on to describe the lightnings not by their models, but by their actions. They emerge in formation. They descend together. They shoot at the same time. None hesitates. None show off. They are like mechanisms. It was the end of the romantic figure of the Knight of the Air. The aerial samurai gave way to the silent executioner, guided by doctrine, mutual coverage, and absolute control of the environment. Discipline replaced instinct. Coldness replaced honor. The P-38s have become symbols of this new logic. They had autonomy for continental range missions, operated in extreme climates, returned with severe damage, and were still reused within hours. As Japan struggled to keep the last Zeros operational, the Americans rotated pilots, updated manuals, and perfected tactics on the fly. Victories were no longer narrated as heroic deeds and began to be read in efficiency reports. Bong himself, the greatest ace in the United States, was not known for catchphrases or theatrical attitudes. His fame came from consistency. He flew with precision, aimed calmly, fired when the calculation said. It was, in essence, the pilot of the future. A man trained to operate within a system and win as part of it. Thomas Maguire followed the same logic. Obsessed with tactics, he organized missions based on wind patterns, solar position, and previous engagement data. He created unofficial manuals to instruct new pilots, basing each movement on real experiences. He did not improvise, figured, and he killed. Warfare had been transformed, not by the impact of a single weapon, but by the introduction of a new mentality. American fighters didn't just fly better, they were piloted by men who thought differently, that flew as part of a living algorithm. By 1944, Japan was no longer fighting individuals. It fought standards, training, procedures. It fought an adaptive doctrine that learned from each combat and returned this learning as a new technical advantage. It was a war in which the American pilot became less of a hero and more of an operational node. His strength came not from personal glory, but from synergy with others, and for the enemy this was terrifying. A Japanese report found in Rabaul bore a symbolic note: they do not hesitate, they do not fail, they are not there for glory, they are there to win. And what came next would make that even clearer, because the skies, once a dueling space, would now be occupied by organized machines of destruction, and Japanese aviation attached to honor would have to look down on it, without even being able to take off. The war, for many, began in the skies of the Pacific, but for engineers and planners it was already lost even before the first takeoff. Because while Japanese hangars sought the artisanal perfection of an aerial warrior, the United States drew victory with drawing boards, timelines, and wind tunnels. The conception of the Zero fighter, still in 1937, followed a clear logic: absolute lightness, extreme agility, and sacrifice of everything that weighed, including the safety of the pilot. No self-sealing tanks, no seat shielding, no bulletproof glass. The focus was to maneuver before being hit and win. But this logic was only sustained in a world where the enemy did not learn, did not improve, did not evolve. A world that would cease to exist on December 7th, 1941. After Pearl Harbor, the U.S. mobilized not only its military, but its technical intelligence. Lockheed, Boeing, North American, Republic, all with access to industrial resources that Japan could never replicate. The American production line not only delivered volume, but delivered variance. The P-38 was the clearest example. With each new batch, direct feedback from the combat pilots generated adjustments to the project, diving flaps to prevent high-speed locking, hydraulic ailerons to maintain control even in extreme maneuvers, improvements to the turbocharger, reinforcement in the armor, sight recalibration. The plane was not a statue, it was a changing organism. In Japan, this cycle simply did not exist. Engineering was centralized, siloed, and suffered from chronic shortages. The naval blockade imposed by the US cut off access to rare metals, synthetic rubber, and special alloys. Many factories operated with outdated equipment, without standardization, and under constant bombardment. The time between design and application bordered on the unreal. While the Americans installed high-speed wind tunnels to test new wings and fairings, Japanese engineers tested in the open field with manual stopwatches and hand-drawn notes. And even when they knew what needed to be changed, they had no way to do it. The A6M-0 had more than 10 versions, but none broke the original structural limitation. The Americans knew this, and they exploited every weakness. The P-38, with its nose-focused armament, eliminated the need for machine gun convergence adjustment. That meant that each burst had full impact, even at 300 meters. The Zero, with dispersed armament in the wings, suffered from decreasing accuracy in distance. Ground tests showed that Lightning could absorb triple the damage of a Zero and still maintain control. The Zero, on the contrary, exploded with a single well-placed shot. It wasn't just a design difference, it was a paradigm shift. The Americans designed their fighters thinking of war as a logistical chain: design, production, training, operation, replacement. The Japanese saw war as an extension of philosophy, and philosophy does not adapt quickly. The artisan seeks excellence. The engineer seeks replicability. Japan was looking for the perfect warrior. The United States was looking for the functional fighter, and functionality, in the 20th century, won. By 1944, Lockheed had already tested more than 15 variants of the P-38. Some were discarded, others have spawned new patterns. This iterative cycle gave pilots an invisible advantage. They were always flying the best version possible. The enemy does not. And if anyone still doubted the superiority of this model, just look at the numbers. The average development time for a new Lightning improvement was 4 months. In Japan, changing a structure took more than a year. The war was already decided, before takeoff, on paper, on the drawing board, on the treadmill of the factory, and while the Americans adjusted to the screw, the Japanese relied on wind, luck, and spirit. But not even the strongest spirit can hold a fighter on fire. Nor does honor hold a 50 burst, and not even the past guarantees heaven, because the heavens were changing, and soon not even the Japanese air elite would have the fuel to climb to them. At the beginning of the war, the skies of the Pacific resembled medieval duels, fights of honor, individual maneuvers, quick reactions, and keen instinct. Japan had built its air doctrine on this model. The pilot was an isolated warrior, trained to improvise, turn, react with almost intuitive precision. Each mission was a test of personal courage. The formation was loose, almost symbolic. Fighting was conducted on initiative, not command. But this, which worked against unprepared adversaries in 1941, would become suicidal in the face of the coordinated machine that emerged from 1943 onwards. The Americans did not fly alone. They flew in pairs, in elements, in squadrons that protected each other, communicated and behaved as an interconnected network. The P-38 Lightning was equipped with long-range VHF radios, allowing each pilot to be connected not only to his wingman, but to the tactical center. Real-time orders, immediate repositioning, surgical interceptions. The Japanese, without reliable radios, flew in silence, and in that silence they died. It was a war between instinct and the system has learned to kill more efficiently. American tactics prioritized altitude, energy, and surprise. The famous boom and zoom maneuver, attack dive, concentrated fire, high-speed climb, was impossible for a Zero to follow. When trying to keep up, the Japanese fighter lost energy, became vulnerable, and crashed. Literally. The P-38 chose the time, the angle, the time of the engagement. The Japanese just reacted. But the most devastating thing was not the weaponry, nor the armor. It was collective thinking. Each lightning was an extension of a larger strategy. Mutual cover between wings prevented ambushes. Constant communication allowed him to reformulate the plan in seconds. The fighting was no longer chaotic. They became tactical executions. The disorder of heaven, which had once favored the skilled, was now organized by those who had data and discipline, and the numbers spoke for themselves. The Lightning's kill rate in certain missions was as high as 6-1. In some theaters, American pilots came back with 3, 4, even 5 victories, without even being shot at. Pause. In 1944, American production of aviation radios exceeded 750,000 units. This ensured that virtually all fighters in operation had full communication, while the Japanese still relied on visual signals and direct visual formation. If this number surprised you, comment, logistics wins, shocking data, or just unbelievable. Because that's what the invisible victory was based on. Organization, the ability to turn planes into tactical nodes and pilots into operators of a larger system. For Japan, the doctrine was a dogma. For the United States, it was a living archive, rewritten every week. Combat reports weren't just for counting kills. They were read by engineers, reviewed by planners, adapted by instructors. By the time the Japanese finally realized an American flaw, it had already been corrected. By the time they mastered a new evasion technique, the Americans had already changed the pattern. It was like playing chess against an opponent who changed the rules every week, and yet played with an advantage. And on this aerial board, the Zeros have become predictable pieces. They entered alone, without cover, without tactical vision. They were lured into ambushes, isolated and destroyed. The sky ceased to be a field of honor and became a network controlled by those who knew where and when to tighten the noose. The result was visible even to the survivors. Japanese accounts go on to mention the feeling of continuous ambush. With each mission, more squads did not return. The new pilots, with little training and no real experience, entered formations that fell apart at first contact. They were shot down without even knowing who had hit them. Meanwhile, the Americans adjusted each attack pattern based on results. There was no personal glory. There was efficiency. There was a repetition of success. There was method. And this method would soon become inescapable, even for those who were no longer on the air, because the next target would no longer be fighter jets, but the clues. High in the Pacific, something was emerging from the horizon that didn't seem made for that time. It didn't have the silhouette of an ordinary fighter jet, nor the sound of a familiar plane. It was a metallic creature with asymmetrical lines, 2 engines spinning in synchrony, 2 parallel tails cutting through the sky like claws. In Japan, it was given names bordering on mysticism. Some called him the two-backed demon, others of the divided ray. But in pilots' letters, field reports, and personal accounts, one name came back with disturbing frequency: Nitaisho no Yokai, the spirit of 2 bodies. It was the P-38 Lightning, and he didn't just kill, he preceded death. The distinctive silhouette of the American fighter became, in itself, a psychological factor of collapse. From a distance, it looked like 2 planes stuck together by a wing. Up close, it seemed too fast, impossible to pursue, similar to nothing the Japanese pilots had faced. And worse, similar to the future, a future they would not reach. The void between the engines, an unprecedented and aerodynamically strange space, came to symbolize the gap between two eras. On the one hand, the aviation of honor, of duel, of courage. On the other, the aviation of calculation, of the system, of the algorithm, and the space between them was impassable. Young Japanese pilots, in hurried formation and with planes already technically obsolete, were sent to the fronts with vague warnings. If you encounter two-tailed fighters, avoid combat. But how to avoid something that seemed to come out of nowhere? The P-38s attacked from above, with the sun at their backs, and disappeared in deep, inaudible dives, as if the sky itself swallowed them. Many reported never having seen the enemy who struck them down. They only heard the impact. Or they woke up at sea. Fear is no longer a reaction and has become a premonition. It started while still on the ground. The mere mention that twin fighters had been spotted in the area was enough to create silence among the mechanics. Some aviators even asked for exemption for night visions. They dreamed of the silver figure of the lightning emerging from behind its wings. It was a war that little by little went beyond the limits of the physical and invaded the symbolic. Because the P-38 didn't just look like an advanced fighter, it seemed like an anomaly, a technological leap that should not be there, as if the United States had imported machines from a future time. And the Japanese, trapped in a logic of romantic war, simply could not decipher that creature. The deep, muffled sound of its turbocharged and optimized Allison engines did not resemble the roars of Japanese radials. It was lower, more constant, almost mechanical, a sound that did not announce attack, but execution. There was no way to respond emotionally to that, because it had no emotion. The P-38 did not duel, did not provoke, did not hesitate. He arrived, shot, left, and he would come back the next day. In a report captured by the American Intelligence Service in Rabaul, a Japanese pilot wrote, "I felt that I was fighting against something that already knew the ending, as if my movements were already written." The phrase was used by U.S. intelligence to describe the psychological impact of lightning. The victory had already begun before takeoff. It started with fear, in reputation, in the silence that was established among officers when discussing the mission, in the cold sweat that flowed before takeoff. War, which was once about courage, was now about acceptance of the inevitable, and the inevitable had two tails. When the lightnings flew over Japanese formations, the Zeros often didn't even react. They knew they couldn't climb up to them, that they would not be able to escape from them, that any attempt at combat would only be stylized suicide. The more experienced officers who had previously encouraged direct confrontation began to recommend caution, evasion, and retreat. A veiled confession, we can't beat them, and this corroded not only morals, it corroded the myth. Because lightning didn't just destroy aircraft, he destroyed the image of the indestructible warrior. And when the image breaks, collapse has no return. But there was something even more symbolic, something that would make the impact of the P-38 eternal. Because the void between its engines, which so intrigued and frightened, would soon be filled by another vision. A bomber coming from behind with no visible escort, crossing the Japanese sky as if it were already his own. And it was. In air warfare, time is invisible fuel. And the big difference between the skies of 1941 and those of 1944 wasn't just in the engines or the guns. It was in the time each pilot brought before pulling the trigger. In the United States, the training of an aviator was thought of as an industrial investment. Cadets went through three main phases: primary, basic, and advanced. By the end, the average USAF pilot accumulated between 500 and 600 flight hours before he even saw the enemy. These hours were not generic. They involved night flying, instrument navigation, simulated combat, emergency maneuvers, and, most revolutionary, analysis of actual footage from previous dogfights. The American pilot was educated not only to fly, but to survive, adapt, and win. He came into combat with a technical record greater than many established enemy aces. In Japan, this time did not exist. The attack on Pearl Harbor had been carried out by an elite forged over years, men like Hiroyoshi Nishizawa and Saburo Sakai, whose reflexes and instincts had been honed since the war in China. But these men had no substitutes, and when they began to fall, the empire resorted to improvisation. The training cycle, which previously took up to 2 years, was reduced to 6 months. The average flight hours dropped to less than 150, with reports of units sending pilots with only 90 hours to the front. Advanced training was cut off, navigation practices are reduced, time in simulators non-existent. What came out of the academy was an idealistic young man with a clean uniform and a sealed destiny. It was the cruelest contrast. Americans produced veterans, the Japanese martyrs. The American logic, based on repetition, feedback, and the accumulation of experience, created pilots who improved with each mission, survived, returned, taught. Japan, on the other hand, fed a hungry front line with fresh meat, expecting miracles from young people they had never fought. And it wasn't just the number of hours, it was the content. An American pilot learned, for example, how to escape diving attacks, how to recognize the sound of an engine failure, how to interpret the behavior of an enemy under stress. It was instructed based on daily reports, engagement statistics, radar records. It flew in different climates, in simulations with veterans, with intelligence officers in the rear. In Japan, the focus was still on honor, control of the joystick, the purity of aerial dueling. The study of data was considered secondary. A good pilot, it was said, sensed the enemy, but lightning wasn't meant to be felt. It appeared, shot, disappeared. And against that, instinct was not enough. Many of the Japanese pilots who went up to face the P-38s did not even know the name of the aircraft. They knew only the silhouette, 2 engines, 2 tails, and the unofficial command: avoid engaging. But even avoiding it required technique. It required altimetry, radar reading, communication. Everything that accelerated training did not provide. When confronted, the reaction was always the same: evasion dive. And in this dive, the Zero lost the corner advantage. It became a target of practice. The average survival rate for rookie Japanese pilots at the end of 1944 was less than 3 missions. Some fell for the former. The Americans knew this, and they used this cycle to their advantage. An experienced P-38 pilot with 200 hours of real combat faced an enemy who barely knew his own aircraft. It was a technical massacre disguised as a battle. In a 1945 internal report, the command of the U.S. 5th Fighter Group stated, "The enemy has lost time. Now he loses his breath." And the phrase was not a metaphor. The lack of veterans has become a strategic vacuum. The experience did not circulate. Japanese doctrine was beginning to be forgotten by the troops themselves. There were planes in the air, but there were no more teachings on the ground. Each pilot who died took with him not only his body, he took his knowledge. On the American side, veterans became instructors, then commanders, then indoctrinators. The cycle was cumulative. In Japan, it was terminal. This mismatch generated an even more visible difference: predictability. The Japanese began to repeat flight patterns, known approaches, outdated formations. Americans recognized these patterns. They anticipated, they counterattacked, and they won. Over time, the surprise disappeared. Only the statistics remained, and she was merciless. In certain units, the Japanese loss rate exceeded 70%. And even so, the young people kept climbing, not out of hope, but because the system no longer knew what to do. They were pieces on a broken clock trying to stop a train. And this train was called industrialization of aerial death. And it came with 2 tails. The Zero of 1945 was, in essence, the same as that of 1940. The same design, the same lightweight structure, the same absence of armor and self-sealing tanks. Its greatest asset, extreme maneuverability, was now irrelevant against enemies who refused to fight by the same rules. Meanwhile, the P-38 was transforming, not in concept, but in iteration. The war had taught the Americans something. An aircraft was no longer a finished piece, it was a living platform. An organism that needed to adapt, learn, and evolve over time. And the P-38 learned. He learned from every shot fired, every mission flown, every failure reported by pilots and mechanics. Lockheed received technical reports directly from the front lines. Engineering teams, along with tactical analysts, translated these reports into real and fast changes. Dive flaps were added after episodes of aerodynamic compression. New heating systems have been installed in the cabins for high-altitude flights. Night navigation systems, previously non-existent, became part of the dashboard. Lighter and stronger materials replaced old alloys. The P-38 also became a rocket launch platform, increasing its ground attack capability. And all this without going out of service. While one model was fighting, its next version was already in the wind tunnels. It was a cycle of continuous improvement that was unthinkable for Japan. There, engineers operated under chronic shortages of strategic materials, without access to large-scale aluminum, with rudimentary tooling and total isolation from the front lines. Japanese doctrine treated aircraft design as the work of master craftsmen, something to be respected, not modified. Result: Zero became a statue, Lightning became a mutant. The American industrial process has become something more than mass production. It became mass intelligence. The war became a laboratory. Each failure became an upgrade. Each mission, a test. Each pilot, a source of data. It wasn't just superiority of resources, it was superiority of method. Japan was fighting in the present. The US was already building the future. By 1945, the P-38J and L were superior performers in all respects: speed, range, firepower, ruggedness, onboard electronics. They could fly above 40,000 feet, launch rockets accurately, operate at night, and return with a broken engine. They were easier to maintain, quicker to fuel, and more versatile on any mission: escort, interdiction, reconnaissance, ground attack. On the other hand, Japan struggled to keep models in flight that were already born obsolete. He tried to create replacements: the Ki-84 Hayate, the J-2M Raiden, the N-1K Shiden, but none of them arrived in sufficient numbers, nor with the necessary reliability. And none, absolutely none, had time to evolve, because time had already been colonized by the enemy. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. Modern warfare did not reward individual brilliance. It rewarded those who learned faster. And if you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content, because history is not only made of battles, but of invisible processes that decide who lives and who disappears. And the next process that would define the course of the war was already about to enter the scene: a faster, more lethal fighter with global reach and a brutal promise to bring destruction to the heart of the empire without asking permission. By the end of 1944, the P-38 was no longer just a fighter, it was a constant presence on the battlefield. The sound of its twin engines had become the harbinger that something was going to happen. But now, that something could come in many forms: attack, interdiction, recognition, persecution. The Lightning had outgrown the traditional air combat role. It had become the vector of a new doctrine: total war from the air. As a reconnaissance aircraft, converted to the F-5 variant, the P-38 covered 90% of all photographic missions carried out in the Pacific. Flight at altitude, great range, stability at cruise. It was the ideal platform for mapping islands, documenting installations, plotting bombing routes. Thanks to him, American intelligence knew every makeshift runway, every fuel depot, every new artillery position hidden beneath the vegetation. No Japanese movement was invisible for more than a few hours, and with the photos came the targets. And with the targets came the attacks. But the P-38 didn't just see, he protected. On escort missions, he accompanied B-17 and B-24 bombers to depths previously considered suicidal, missions over Taiwan, Indochina, the Philippines, always with the same logic: fly higher, attack from above, open the way, and come back. For the bomber crew, seeing a pair of P-38s crossing the sky next to them was like seeing aluminum angels. For the Japanese, it was an omen. An air raid without lightning was a chance for survival. With lightning, it was statistical. The fighters tried to climb up to intercept, but the altitude was too much, the range too long, the speed of entry and exit merciless. The P-38 eliminated surprise, and with it, eliminated hope. Its radius of action covered practically the entire Central Pacific. Bases in Saipan, Guam, Morotai, New Guinea. With each advance of the Marines, the lightning advanced with it, as a permanent shadow of the American effort. The war was now in 3 dimensions: land, sea, and air, with air dominance dictating everything the other dimensions could and could not do. But perhaps the most lethal role of the P-38 was in interdiction. Surgical strikes against convoys, depots, bridges, radars, communication stations. At diving speed, using rockets, bombs, or his 450 and centered 20mm cannon, he could eliminate a target before the warning siren was triggered. No one was safe, nor in motion, not even hidden, not even at night. Pilots trained in instrument navigation, equipped with cabin warmers, approach lights and detailed maps, cruised entire islands in fog, over the sea or between mountains. Japan tried to camouflage. He tried to disperse. He tried to build again. But American doctrine was clear: if you can see it, you can destroy it. And the P-38 saw everything. Each reconnaissance mission became an attack mission. Each lone flight could be the harbinger of a mass bombing. Every Japanese radar that detected the echo of 2 parallel tails knew what was coming. And there was no counterattack. There was no way to react to an enemy that dominated time, space, and altitude. The Japanese mentality, forged in direct confrontations, duels of courage, and physical endurance, was simply inadequate for a war where the enemy did not ask for a fight, only executed, and where distance, once allied with the islands, had become a trap. Because the farther away, the more dependent Japan became on fragile lines of supply. These lines were cut by fighters that flew 700, 800, even 1,000 miles to destroy a target and return safely. It was the antithesis of what was believed to be possible. And this is where the irony becomes unbearable. The plane considered too big for dogfight has become the most accurate weapon in air warfare. A Japanese intelligence officer wrote in 1945, "We no longer fight pilots. We fought the whole sky, molded against us." This was the new battlefield, and lightning was his signature, the signature that would soon give way to something even faster and more devastating. When the engines went silent in August 1945, it wasn't just Japan that fell to its knees. It was an idea, an age-old code of honor, reincarnated in the air with light wings and elegant maneuvers, collapsed before a machine that did not share the same faith. Bushido, a spiritual and military doctrine, taught that courage and will were absolute forces, that the warrior, pure of intentions and firm of spirit, was invincible even when surrounded, even when wounded. But against the P-38 Lightning, spirit was not enough. It could not be met with honor, only endured with despair. The Japanese pilots, trained in academies that extolled sacrifice, were thrown into the air against an enemy that did not duel, that he didn't look him in the eye. that he did not accept invitations to hand-to-hand combat. Lightning didn't fight for glory, he fought for goals, and in doing so, he dismantled an entire philosophical construct. In interviews conducted after the war, survivors confessed not only to military defeat, but to emotional breakdown. Many said they did everything right, they flew bravely, followed their teachings, faced without hesitation, and yet they lost. Because in the new paradigm of war, doing everything right meant adapting, measuring, calculating, testing. It was not enough to fight with fervor. It was necessary to fight with information. Bushido, centered on the individual, now faced a collective, decentralized, mechanical, and efficient adversary. There was no longer a symbolic battlefield. There were missions, targets, reporting, and this detachment between ideal and reality was the deepest wound. A Japanese pilot, interviewed in 1946, stated, "We expected the enemy to fight as we did, but he just won." The Lightning had become more than a fighter. It was the living metaphor for modern warfare. Two tails, two engines, and no room for romanticism. Each takeoff was a mathematical operation, each fight an extension of the industry. Japan flew with its heart. The United States with schedule and logistics. The Japanese tradition, which extolled the mastery of artisanal technique, proved powerless in the face of mass iteration. The Zero, the result of talented hands and visionary engineers, had been surpassed not by punctual genius, but by a national gear that produced, tested, corrected, and repeated. Bushido, for the first time, faced an enemy that was not an army, it was a system. And systems are not moved. The spiritual warfare waged in the skies of the Pacific became a monologue. On the one hand, sacrifice, on the other, statistics. And in the end, statistics won. The most experienced Japanese riders were all lost in the first 2 years. What was left was a hurried generation with a few hours of flight time, sent against trained adversaries, protected, coordinated by radio and supported by real-time air intelligence. In 1945, Japan trained pilots with 100 hours. The Americans arrived at the front with 600. The difference was no longer moral, it was structural. And when there is no more parity, the code of honor becomes a sentence. The letters of the last Japanese combatants reveal a tone of resignation not seen in previous years. Many flew knowing that they would be shot down. Others could no longer even distinguish the enemy. They come from the sky like metal demons. They reach before we see it. They flee before we understand. The war had become invisible, and therefore unbearable. Defeat was no longer a possibility. It was a process, and no one there could stop him. Honor, which had once sustained the warrior's soul, was now all that was left for those who no longer had a chance. And even that was beginning to seem useless. The Lightning didn't just shoot down planes, it shot down certainties. It overturned the faith that individual worth could beat the machine. That courage was enough. That tradition would save the future. The war did not end with a duel. It ended with a silence. And silence is often the sound of an empire accepting what it can no longer deny. There was a new world in the air, and he didn't speak Japanese. But as we will see below, this acceptance was not universal. On the other side of the planet, a power still believed that it could bend the sky at its will, and for that it would bet everything on a fighter that promised to stand up to the Lightning. The problem? He would arrive too late. What remained in Japan after the smoke were not only ruined cities, but devastated internal landscapes. In the villages, mothers waited for letters that never arrived. At train stations, parents lined up in front of the name boards, looking for children who had flown off, and they never landed. The post-war silence was not just the cessation of arms, it was the echo of an absence that not even Shinto chants could fill. The P-38, for many Japanese, has become more than an aircraft. It has become a spectre, a name whispered with bitterness, respect, and fear. In letters found decades later, written by young kamikazes in the last days of the conflict, a recurring observation appears. They don't fight like us. They don't hesitate. They are always above. There was no hatred in these lines. There was understanding, the painful acceptance that they had entered a war they did not fully understand. Survivors like Saburo Sakai, who returned blind in one eye and with his body riddled with shrapnel, dedicated the post-war period to reconstruction, but not just material. Sakai, who had shot down more than 60 enemy aircraft, became an advocate of aviation based on science, data, and modernization. He understood that what Japan lacked was not honor, it was time. Time to adapt, to rethink, to accept that individual heroism, although glorious, was insufficient in the face of an enemy that fought in a network, en masse, in iteration. Pilots who returned injured or defeated reported recurring nightmares, not with explosions or pain, but with the muffled, growing sound of two engines coming from above, with no warning, no escape. Some never flew again. Others went on to teach English, study engineering, build bridges instead of crossing clouds. And this is where the deepest irony is revealed. The P-38, which symbolized for the Japanese the collapse of an empire, also became a symbol of what was to come later, on industrial reconstruction, from the bet on knowledge, of the decision never again to be surprised by a foreign machine. Post-war Japan did not deny its pain. It used it as fuel. The generation that was defeated in the air created the foundation of a nation that, 2 decades later, would build passenger planes, bullet trains, and microprocessors. And many of these engineers grew up hearing stories from the heavens, not as victories, but as warnings. The P-38 for these young people was not just a memory of the past. It was a reminder that the future belongs to those who change the fastest. The war, after all, does not end when the last shot is fired. It continues in dreams, in mourning, in inherited technologies, and in the silent decisions of the post-war period. Memory is a weapon more enduring than any missile, and in this case, it shaped an entire country. But before the Japanese got back on their feet, another confrontation was taking shape. A completely different theater, with a new technological powerhouse trying to repeat lightning's dominance. The problem? The skies of Europe were already full of echoes. And the Germans, like the Japanese, also believed that building a fast fighter was enough to change the war. They were about to discover that it wasn't the fighter that decided, it was the system. Saburo Sakai, one of the last ghosts of the old Japanese sky, ended his life in peace. But peace did not erase the memory of the sound that changed everything. 2 engines in sync, cutting through the clouds with the roar of the future. He survived the duel, but not time. He saw his doctrine crumble. He saw Bushido bow before gears, and he saw what he called the end of an era. The P-38 Lightning didn't just win for range, speed, or firepower. It won because it was the physical expression of something bigger, a wartime thinking based on science, repetition, precision, and scale. The Japanese defeat wasn't just in the skies, it was in the concept. War, which had begun as a stage for the individual hero, has become an impersonal system where data trumps dogma. The lesson is clear and universal. Logistics determines strategy, industry sets the pace, and the real power is no longer in the pilot, but in the ability to learn faster than the enemy. As General Alfred Jodl confessed, already at the surrender in Rams, we were not defeated by tanks or planes, we were crushed by a production line. If you value this type of research, memory, and cold analysis of what really happened, enjoy the video and subscribe to the channel. This helps to keep the search for historical truth alive. Comment here which data shocked you the most, and activate the bell so you don't miss the next devastating event of World War II. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.